Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's get right into it. Today we are talking about a massive event that could completely rewrite the rules between the government and big business. The US government is now a direct owner in Intel, the legendary American chipmaker. So let's break down how this happened, and more importantly, why.
So let's just start with the big headline number. We're talking about almost $9 billion. But here's what's so wild about this. It's not a loan. Something Intel has to pay back. Nope, this is the US government buying a piece of the company, a direct ownership stake. And while the money is huge, the real story is what this signals about the future.
For as long as anyone can remember, there's been this really clear line, right? The government over here, private companies over there. Well, this deal just took a big eraser to that line. This is so different from a bailout or some kind of subsidy. We're talking about the government becoming an actual part owner of one of the most important tech companies on the planet.
So the big question is, how on earth did a deal like this even happen? I mean, it's pretty wild. It's actually a really clever bit of financial maneuvering, basically trading future promises for ownership right now. Okay, so let's break down how this actually works. You've got the Department of Commerce, and they're basically the investor. They had already promised Intel billions of dollars in grants for the future. What they did was say, all right, forget those future payments, and in exchange for that, Intel handed over a massive chunk of its stock, plus these things called warrants, which are basically just a fancy way of saying they have the option to buy even more stock later on.
So let's walk through the steps. It all started with what's called a direct funding agreement, or DFA. Pretty standard stuff, right? The government promises cash to help Intel build more factories here in the US, but then they changed the game. They pivoted. Instead of just letting that cash drip out over time, the government basically came in and said, you know what? Never mind the future cash, just give us a piece of the company, right now.
And you have to understand, this wasn't just some bean counters trying to be clever with money. Oh no, this was a massive strategic play, and it's all about geopolitics. A lot of people watching this are saying, whoa, this could be a real turning point. It's a sign that the whole American style of capitalism might be shifting, becoming way more hands-on, all because of the intense competition we're seeing around the globe.
And if you look at the history here, you can really see how we got to this point. I mean, the US government has always had a hand in industry, right? Back in the 50s, they were directing steel production for national security. More recently, you had the huge subsidies from the CHIPS Act. But the goal was always to kind of nudge private companies from the outside. What's happening with Intel is a whole different ballgame. The government isn't just nudging anymore. They've pulled up a chair and taken a seat at the boardroom table as an owner, and that's all about making sure our critical tech supply chains are secure.
So, this is really the key difference, isn't it? We're moving away from a system where the government just sets the rules for the game, to a new world where the government is actually one of the players on the field. It's a huge shift from just offering support from a distance to having direct influence. And that brings up this really interesting idea of a golden share. The idea that the government's stake could be used to push Intel's decisions in a direction that helps national security, even if it's not the most profitable move.
So what's the big idea here? What's the master plan behind this much more hands-on approach? Well, as it turns out, analysts actually have a name for this playbook, and it really gets to the heart of competing on the world stage, especially in that tech race with China.
Yeah, they're calling it corporate nationalism. And the thinking goes something like this. You take all the powerful tools of capitalism, like owning stock, but you don't just use them to make money. You use them to hit strategic goals, like, say, beating China in the tech race or bringing critical manufacturing back home. Now, of course, the term like corporate nationalism can be a bit loaded, politically speaking. So it's good to remember it's just one way of looking at this huge policy shift.
And this strategy has more than one play in its book. It's not just about trading cash for stock like we're seeing with Intel. It's also about using all the other levers the government has. Think about it. They have to approve big mergers, they control export licenses, they can use all of that as leverage. At the end of the day, the goal is crystal clear. Make absolutely sure that companies in these super important sectors are rowing in the same direction as US national security.
Okay, but a move this big, this bold, it's not without some serious risks, right? And what's really fascinating is that you don't have to guess what they are. Intel itself laid them all out, plain as day, for everyone to see.
I mean, this is straight from Intel's own paperwork filed with the government. They're openly talking about some major worries. First off, when you just create a bunch of new shares, it waters down the value for every other investor out there.
That's a big deal. Then you have the whole governance mess. What happens when the government's goals don't line up with the shareholders' goal of making as much money as possible? Plus, having Uncle Sam as a major shareholder could totally freak out potential business partners and, yeah, create some massive headaches on the world stage. And this right here, this chart just perfectly shows you what we're talking about with that geopolitical risk. I mean, look at that. Intel is a global powerhouse. A whopping 76% of its money comes from outside the US. So you have to ask, how are other countries, especially competitors, going to feel about buying their most advanced computer chips from a company that's partially owned by the US government? It could put a huge chunk of Intel's business in jeopardy.
And that really brings us to the core debate here. On one side, you have the people who say this is an absolutely brilliant and necessary move. It secures our technology, it gets corporate America on the same page as national America. But on the other side, you have critics who are sounding the alarm bells loud and clear. They're worried this opens the door to a kind of crony capitalism, where success is based on who you know in Washington, not on who has the best product.
So, where do we go from here? What does this all mean? Is this Intel deal just a one-off thing, a special case because chips are so important? Or are we looking at the playbook for a whole new way of doing business in America?
When you boil it all down, what this does is fundamentally change the government's job. For, 100 years, the government has basically been the referee, right? Blowing the whistle, making sure everyone plays by the rules of the market. But by buying a stake in Intel, the government just put on a jersey and ran out onto the field. This isn't just them changing a rule. It feels like they're trying to change the entire game.
And so that's the massive question we're left with. As the government gets its hands directly involved in these key industries, are we seeing the start of a stronger, more secure American economy? Or is this the top of a very slippery slope, one that leads to a world where free markets are just, well, not so free anymore, and everything is decided by politics? How we answer that question is going to define our economy for a very, very long time.